chapter 5, and we're going to continue our studies of Nehemiah, and we want to look at it from the perspective of leadership, which we've been dealing with now. This is lesson number 7 in this series, and we have talked about the leader's prayer, how Nehemiah prayed at the very beginning. He was broken. He was sorrowful over the condition of his city, Jerusalem. He himself was a captive, if you remember, the cupbearer for the king. And we went through the different stages that a leader goes through as he tries to lead God's people and complete various projects. And so we've looked at several things, and we stated very clearly at the very beginning, and I believe this with all my heart. I believe it more now than I used to. I didn't understand it as much as I think I do now. But everything rises and falls on leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's your family, your house. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's a bus route. I don't care if it's a music ministry. I don't care what it is. It rises and falls on leadership. And so the key to small groups are the leaders over the groups. If the leaders are good, the groups will succeed. If the leader is sorry and just sorry, it will not be a good group. The same thing is true with a bus route. A good bus route is only built on a good bus captain. A sorry bus captain will build a sorry route. It's just that simple. I don't care how you select. Nobody likes to hear that. But that's just the way it is. Churches are built on leadership. And they're built on pastoral leadership and the leaders under them. I had a guy here who was in this church. He had a master's degree in music. Now, he'd been in our church years and years ago and sang in the choir. And then he got his master's degree from Pensacola Christian College. And then he worked in another church for about 15 years. And then finally, they showed up and came back here. And he wanted to work with the choir. I said, go for it. I said, go for it. Here's a guy with a master's degree, couldn't get 6 women in the choir. And he got mad at me. You remember that story? He got mad at me. He wanted me to get him the numbers and build the choir so he could direct it. See, he couldn't lead it, he could direct it. You know what I mean? If I build it for him. And I wouldn't do it. So I'm not going to build your choir for you, you build it. And he couldn't, and then he wrote me a letter accusing our people of not being spiritual. I said, it's amazing when somebody else leads it, they're spiritual. And you know who came in after? It was Jennifer Hansen came in after him and built a choir of 30 people. So it's leadership. That's all it is. Leadership is influence. It's just influence. That's all it is. And so it's not a position. You're not a leader because you have a title or a position. Doesn't mean a thing. And so everything rises and falls on leadership. At work, in church, in your home, at school, it's all the same. Doesn't make any difference. So as we think about what Nehemiah, I don't think there's a better example of a leader than Nehemiah. I'm sure Jesus was a better leader. But I don't know of a better example. I can't find anything in Jesus' ministry that as far as leadership is concerned, that was any more successful than what Nehemiah did. And so we said in chapter 2, if you remember, leaders first start by, in chapter 2, they first started by derision. If you remember, they derided him and made fun of him. They tried to laugh him out of doing the work. One of the weaknesses of folks who would be leaders is fear. They're afraid. And some people are afraid of success. If I succeed, it'll be more work. And they're afraid of success. Some people are afraid of failure. So if I don't do anything, I can't fail. Some people are afraid of criticism. If I lead, I will be criticized. You cannot lead without being criticized. You can't do anything without being criticized. Do nothing and you'll be criticized. So you might as well get criticized for doing something. And so they criticized him, and his response was to ignore it. Basically, when people ridicule you and put you down for what you're doing for the Lord, just ignore it. Don't pay any attention to it. I could care less. Now, in my younger days, I did care. But I didn't care. I cared for a selfish reason. I don't care that much anymore. I don't have anything to prove. The second thing is they tried discouragement. And, they came and said, you know that you're tired and that you're not going to be able to finish and it's hopeless and there's too much rubble. And these are the naysayers. They always can point out why it won't work and why they can't do it. Nehemiah had to deal with them, and it got many of the people discouraged. And it doesn't take a whole lot of that. And so his response to discouragement was simply to reorganize, which means he had to replace some people. He had to reorganize and remember the Lord. Those are the two things. And so he put people by families and in strength groups. Let me tell you, it's easier for a lion to lead a flock of sheep than it is for a sheep to lead a pride of lions. And I think the reason is obvious. And so the next tactic that came along was danger. They started threatening them. The opposition who didn't want the wall built was Sanballat and Tobiah, if you remember that crowd. And they said, we're going to come and kill you guys when you're not looking. That's pretty serious business. You have somebody threatening your life, and they threatened them, and they tried to scare them into quitting. And Jesus said that a hireling fleeth when he seeth the wolf, but the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So you can't run just because there's a problem, just because you're scared, just because you're threatened. And so Nehemiah's response was to resist it. He resisted it. And then they tried derision and discouragement and danger. And so tonight we're going to talk about how they tried to use division and discord. Division and discord. They tried to create internal conflict. And listen to me, when you get people fighting each other, they're ineffective after that. And so chapter 4 was the opposition from the outside. Chapter 5 is the opposition from the inside. And you've heard me say this, that when my wife is in my corner, I can handle about anything. But if you're having trouble at home, you can't do much. You're handicapped to start with, because you and your wife are one whether you want to admit it or not. And if she's not supportive of you 100% of the time, you're going to have trouble. So she needs to be in your corner. And she needs to be present, needs to be, just to know that you have her support and her encouragement. And so, but once the division takes place within the house, nothing else goes right. I was talking to Brother Murphy today, and I don't know how we got onto this subject this afternoon, but you see, the way the devil does is he divides and conquers. He divided the angels, and that they fell first from heaven. Then he divided Adam and Eve. He got her to sin first. And then he divided the nation of Israel. Jesus said a house that's divided against itself cannot stand. And those who want to bring about chaos and revolution realize that you have to divide the country first. And thus you have North and South Vietnam, right? You divide, you create ethnic groups, and then you turn these groups against each other. You keep emphasizing the inequities in a particular group. And you have labor and union against each other. and you have the students and the faculty against each other, and you have the North and the South against each other, and you have the Democrats and the Republicans against each other. You see, you work on division, and that's how you bring about a catastrophe and a collapse. So the Lord said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So the devil's greatest tactic is dividing a church. As long as the church is unified, it's going to stand. Common sense will tell you that, right? You don't have to be too smart to figure that out. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. So Satan tries to divide them, and so he uses different things. Tell you what he used here. He uses money. Isn't that typical? There's more conflicts over finances than anything else. The major cause of divorce is over finances. That is the number one cause of divorce in America, is money. That's it. You might think it's something else, but it isn't. It's over money. So Satan, he brings these things in, and he's going to try to divide people over the financial issues, over who's going to control the money and how the money should be spent, and my money and your money, and all that kind of stuff. And it goes on and on. Either mismanaging or not having it. And so we wonder, and we'd ask, does the devil still use division today? Of course he does. And as I said, internal problems destroy more churches than external problems. I don't know that in the almost 40 years that Open Door's been here that we've had too much opposition from the outside. I don't know what it's been. But, I've had folks in the church to try to split it and take a few people with them and all that kind of nonsense. But, that's why when you join this church and you go through Class 101, we insist that you sign a covenant stating you will not gossip. So when you start gossiping and causing division, you're a liar right up front. Right? Sure, you said you wouldn't. And so, why? Because that's the greatest tactic, greatest weapon the devil has, is gossip and division and internal strife. Jesus said in Mark 3:25, if a house be divided against itself, it cannot stand. And, you can watch a ball team defeat themselves. All the players have to do is start fighting each other. And they get mad at each other, and they won't work as a team. And pretty soon, division happens. And usually, you can have division when you've got two or more people, especially, when they want their own way. So, if you don't deal with conflict, and it's going to come, it always does, and that's human nature, then it's going to stop the work and of the Lord in your life, because ultimately, if you're going to do anything for the Lord, you're going to have some conflict. That's just it. That's why a lot of people won't do anything. They don't want conflict. They don't want to deal with it. And so you have to learn to deal with it in the Lord's work, or you're not going to do anything, and He can't do anything in your life. That's why a lot of people won't serve in the Lord. They want to avoid conflict. How many of you like conflict? Well, good. I don't either. I think some people do, but I really don't. I don't like it. So this chapter is very important because it teaches us conflict management, how to deal with it. And verse 1 through 5 gives us the cause of conflict, and then verse 6 through 13 in this chapter will give you the cure. I want you to look at the cause of conflict. And as you look at the background of this chapter, the people were spending all their time working on the wall. And they didn't have time to cultivate their gardens or to raise food. Look at verse 1 in chapter 5. And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren, the Jews. For there were that said, we, our sons, our daughters are many. Therefore we take up corn for them, that we may eat and live. Some also there were that said, we have mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses, that we might buy corn, because of the drought. There were also that said, we have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our land and our vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of the brethren, of our brethren, our children as their children, our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought into bondage already, neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and our vineyards. So you can see the problem here that certainly would cause conflict. And the first complaint had to do about food shortages, because there were too many mouths to feed. And in the next verse, you find there was a famine. And, that's a pretty tough situation, because here they are fighting battles, trying to build a building, and they've got famine going on top of that. So resources and goods were in short supply. And there were more mouths to feed than they had food. And there was inflation and high prices and all of this. And I think it's interesting, because they are doing the work of God, and yet God allows a famine. And I preached a little bit on this Sunday morning, because folks think if they're doing God's work, there won't be a famine. They think if they're doing the work of God, there shouldn't be a problem. But problems come. And the key is, how do we deal with them? Well, they were doing what they were told to do. And I think that, that God's will doesn't exempt you from difficulty. And Christians have a hard time getting that. They think, if I love the Lord and read my Bible and start tithing and going to church regularly and doing everything I shouldn't have any problems. Well, it would be nice, but it doesn't work that way. It just does not work that way. And so they're having all kinds of problems. And so just because you're doing the right thing doesn't mean that, that your car's not going to break down, or that you're not going to have a major health problem or something else. And so there was a food shortage, according to verse 2. And this would cause conflict, of course. The second thing is that they had over-mortgaged in their homes in verse 3. Some said, we've mortgaged our land and our vineyard and our houses that we can buy corn. So there was a famine in the land. They were having to mortgage. They probably didn't have jobs, and they were having to take out their equity they had in their house and mortgage that in order to buy food. And that's really what you call financial bondage, because they were using their equity to feed their family, and that's a losing proposition. And they were taking the equity out of their homes and mortgaging them deeper and deeper into debt. So and then in verse 4 they said that we have borrowed money for the king's tribute. So high taxes were the third problem here. Can you identify with any of this? Well, of course, and get used to it, because they're going to get higher. And so now they're having to borrow money just to pay the taxes, to keep the debt. And so they're getting deeper in debt. So as a result of this, if you look at verse 5, yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, that is, they owned it, our children as their children, and lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants. They were selling them. And some of our daughters are brought into bondage already. They'd already sold them as slaves or servants. Neither is there any power, that is, we don't have any money to buy them back. For other men have our land and our vineyards. So we can't sell our land. We've mortgaged it. We can't sell anything. We don't have anything. And they've sold their sons and daughters as slaves. And so the next thing here is bondage of their sons and daughters was their fourth complaint. So they had to have food. So they first mortgaged their houses, and then they started selling off their family to raise money. Now that, certainly to a Westerner at this time of life and this age in which we live in, that's a strange sounding thing. But in many countries in the world today, it's not uncommon for families to sell their young daughters especially. But people sell their families because they don't have any money. So they sell them. We have a hard time identifying them with that because we're too busy, listening to our iPod and playing Nintendo or whatever is new. But, there are people around the world that have to sell their sons and daughters just to survive. See? And many times they sell them, they think they're selling them into an important job, and they turn out to make them prostitutes. And in Thailand and some of these other countries, that's one of the major issues. These young girls, they think they're applying for jobs, and they come to this country sometimes, and especially to some of these other countries, and they wind up in brothels, and they die there. So it's a sad thing. It's horrible. So it's high taxes and high mortgages and high prices and forced to work overtime. And it sounds like, exactly what's going on in America today. And but the hard times were not the real problem. There were hard times, of course. But there was a great cry. If you look at it in verse 1, it says, "And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren." Now there's the problem. And what they were doing is they were complaining about each other. And the rich Jews, in some case, were exploiting the poor Jews in a time of crisis. And they were taking advantage and capitalizing on their misfortune of the poor people. And those who had money and had food were saying, if you don't sell me your house, if you'll sell me your house, I'll give you food. And, I'll lend you money, but it's going to be at a high interest rate. It's going to be about 25%. So rather than helping and giving to the poor, they were charging them high interest and repossessing their homes and taking their children as slaves, and had total disregard for the misfortune of the people and only thinking about themselves. How can I take advantage of this problem? In most cases, everybody's problem is somebody's opportunity. You got a vulture sitting on the fence somewhere just waiting for you to break a leg so they can come in for the kill. And so what they were doing was clearly against God's law. I want you to go to Exodus with me. Keep your place here. And go back to Exodus chapter 2. I think it's Exodus 2. And that sure is not right. Is it 22? What is the reference? Okay, I've got the wrong I've just got 225. Okay. I didn't think that was going to work. It's too early in the book. But look at 22:25. "If thou lendest money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as an usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury." Now, usury is interest. That's interest. So God forbid a Jew to charge another Jew interest. They could loan them money, and many times that's why Jews didn't want to loan them money. They loved Gentiles. They could charge a Gentile interest. They were allowed to, but they could not charge a Jew interest. Now, does that mean a Christian can't charge a Christian interest? Well, of course not, but if you're a Christian and you want to loan me some money, we can sure apply this. But, I wish it were so when I'm borrowing. When I'm lending, I wouldn't know who to lend it to get any interest back, which I don't do that anyway, but you understand my story. So it was clearly against God's law, as you can see. They couldn't charge interest, but they were, as I said, they were allowed to do this to Gentiles. And so if somebody was poor and came and worked for them, but were not a slave, they were clearly violating God's law. The rich here in this passage are blatantly violating the laws, and they were profiting from the famine that was going on. And so a law of leadership is that the root cause of internal conflict and discord is always selfishness. The root cause of internal conflict and discord in the home, at work, in the church, is always selfishness. Whether you have conflict with your family, or a boyfriend, or your church, or the office, or school, the bottom line of conflict is always selfishness. Look at James 4:1. James 4:1, way back to the back of your Bible. And James says, "From whence cometh wars and fighting among you?" Among you. Well, he's writing to believers, And they must have been fighting and warring among themselves. Now why? Well, he says, come they not hence, even the lust that warred in your members. And so it is a lust for power, or lust for possessions, or whatever. So the cause of conflict is selfishness. You ought to remember that. So when my wants conflict with your wants, there's always then we've got a problem. And so you have conflict and division. I think the most fulfilling part of leadership, in my opinion, is working with people. To me, that's the most fulfilling part of it. It's not the pulpit. It's not that. I love working with people. I love helping people. I like to see people grow. I like to see people succeed. I like to see that happen. I like to see people used of God to discover their gifts and use them. See, when people discover their gifts and you help them use those, you don't have to motivate them. They're motivated, they motivate themselves. And you don't have to be a cheerleader, or it doesn't have to be a pep rally. Internal motivation is the most valuable kind. You're motivated because you love what you do. Well, how do you get people to love what they do? They learn to do it well. You help them do it well. You teach them and train them, and they do it well. People always like to do a good job at what they're doing. It gives them pride and all of that, you see. And I'm talking about a good kind of pride in accomplishment. So, but I think the most frustrating part of leadership is working with people. So they go ahead and ahead. It's like raising your children. The greatest joy comes from your children, but sometimes the greatest problems come from your children, you see. Now, if you'd have known that before you had any, you wouldn't have had them. But now that you got them, you love them, you see. And that's okay, because the joy outweighs the difficulties and the problems. But the thing about leadership, you always have that. As I said, the most fulfilling part of leadership is working with people, but the most frustrating part of leadership is working with people, because people intend to be selfish, including myself. I'm selfish. I want my way. I've said that before. I'm an only child. I'm a spoiled brat. And I tell everybody around here, I am not hard to get along with. Just do what I say, and there won't be any problem. Isn't that kind of the way you like to lead? Of course. And we want to do our own thing, and so the result is we don't always want to do the thing that is best, and so we put ourselves first, and that can be very, very frustrating. We think ourselves that this is what causes conflict. It's always selfish. Number two, I want you to think about the cure for conflict. And so in verse 1, we'll notice that the men and the women raised a great outcry against their own people. And really, this is much worse than fighting the enemy, because the enemy now is, the first enemy was external, and you can rally the troops together. When the planes hit the towers in New York, did you know all America was unified about 95 to 97%? The whole country was unified. They were almost 100% behind the president. But the war, you see, is becoming a thing of the past, and now, through certain means, the enemy now is our government, and the enemy is our president. You see, and that's not true. I'm being facetious here. I don't believe that at all. But that's the concept, and so therefore, the thing is divided about 50-50 now, as far as our government's concerned, and maybe even more so. But I don't really worry too much about our enemies outside if we can rally the troops on the inside. You know what? I don't worry about it if we can rally America together. But when America is divided, the enemies outside love that, and the ones on the inside. So when men and their wives, they raise this outcry against their own people. And as I said, that's much worse than an external enemy. And so when you're fighting each other, you're dividing yourselves apart. You are damaging your own body and your own family. Step number 1, he said, when I heard their outcry, I was very angry. You see that? Down about, let me see what verse here. Verse 6, okay. He said, when I heard their outcry, I was very angry. Now, Nehemiah didn't ignore the problem. In fact, he took it seriously. And if you're a leader of any kind, of a group, and the harmony of your group is threatened, you better get angry. A fellow that you can't get mad about something happening to his group is not a good leader. You cannot be passive about what's happening. You have to get upset. And he is angry here. And really, if you're any kind of a leader of a group, as I said, and the harmony is threatened, then you better get angry, because it's very, very important. Because as a leader, you are to protect the harmony of your home. If somebody tries to destroy your home, would you just say, oh hum? Why, you ought to get as mad as you know what. Why not? You know, somebody tries to corrupt your kids, you ought to get fighting mad. It's not a sin to be mad. See, the problem with America is we become passive sissies. Now, really, you know, I counsel enough people all the time. You know who the average person is? It's the woman comes in. You know, men are passive. They are. They let women handle the fights. They let women take the front. They let women. You know, it's not the woman's fault. It's because the man won't step up to the plate. See, we need some men in America, and we've got wimps. Now, we really do. We've got wimps. I don't mean you need to be a bully. I don't mean that at all. But you need to take the leadership. You need to take the leadership. And I love my wife dearly, supremely. I love her with all my heart. But I'm not going to be a wimp. I'm not. Now, we talk about things, but you understand? And you should. I had a fellow one time work for me. I said, you know what? You need to get your wife in order. This is a guy on staff. I said, you need to get your wife in order. He said, I tried to in Illinois, and she threatened to leave me. I said, you ought to let her leave you. Why? You know what I'd do if my wife threatened to leave me? I'd go open the door. Now, she'd do the same thing for me. You know why? You can't let threats control you. You're whipped. That'd be like some guy in this church coming up and saying, Pastor Blue, if you don't do this, we're going to quit the church. I'd say, just a minute, I'll go open the door for you. Well, I wouldn't, you know, I'm not going to be held hostage by anybody. By my kids. My kids say, I'll run away from home. I say, okay, don't let the door hit your backside on the way out. My kids aren't going to run my house. They're not going to run it. I'm the father. I'm the dad. I am responsible. You understand me? I'm not their buddy. I'm their father. Now, when they get to be about 40, we'll be buddies. But I'm not a buddy of a 6-year-old. My 6-year-old, my 7-year-old, my 10-year-old, my 12-year-old, my 13-year-old. We're not buddies. I'm your dad. And you're going to do what I say. There's going to be H-E-L-L to pay. You understand? Amen. Sure. Sure. You say you're trying to scare them. I guess scaring's okay. The fear of the Lord's the beginning of wisdom. See? So, and some of you men, if you just stand up to the plate, Your wife will fight you. Just tell her to shut up. Okay? You say, well, you sound like you're getting angry. That's a good sign of leadership. It's a good sign of leadership. I'll be counseling divorcees here next week. Or murderers. Now, I mean exactly what I'm saying, in case you think I'm just playing games. I mean exactly what I'm saying. I don't think anybody ought to be a bully. I think you ought to lead. I think you ought to love your wife as Christ loved the church. That means you ought to lay down your life for her. But it doesn't mean you ought to lay down and not take the leadership. You think Jesus Christ is going to abdicate his leadership? You think he's going to give up his throne to get along with people? See? So a good leader needs to get some fire in his bones and needs to get upset when somebody tries to damage his home or his church or his Sunday school class or his bus route or his ministry. I mean, if you're going to let people sabotage it, there's something wrong with you. See? And so let me just say, first of all, when he heard these things, he said, I got angry. Did you know the Bible says God is angry? Of course, you didn't know that. You know God's love, but you didn't know God is a consuming fire, did you? And you didn't know that God is angry at the wicked all day long. God just stays mad. I know this surprises some of you because you've been reading Good News for Modern Man or something. Did you know that Jesus was angry? Did you know Paul said, be angry? Did you know he said that? Of course you didn't. But he did. He said, be angry and sin not. Anger is not a sin. The absence of anger is a sin. So you ought to get upset about some things, but the key is to get upset about the right things. See, most people don't know what to be mad at. You see? And they're mad at their people. They're mad at each other. They're mad at the brethren, or something. That's not the key there. That's not what I'm even suggesting. And so anger is very appropriate sometimes. And sometimes it's the right thing to do. You ought to read in the book of, I think it's Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, where it talks about something about the king that drives away wickedness from before the throne, his countenance. That would be his angry countenance. And so Nehemiah was very angry. And it's, as I said, it's commanded of God in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 26. Anger is not a sin. So one of the first things you need to do if there's disharmony caused by selfishness, then you as a leader ought to get upset. Because you ought to get upset at selfishness in yourself and in other people as well. So take it seriously. There's the right kind of anger and the wrong kind of anger, and leadership knows the difference. They know the difference. His was not personal. Nobody was hurting him, but he got angry and was striking back because of these that were taking advantage of his people. And this is what was going on. So the point is we need to be angry at sin. And a leader without some fire in his or her bones is not much of a leader. You're not much of a leader if you don't get some fire in your bones, because you can't be serious about what's going on. So you need, when you see something is destroying the harmony in your family or your church or your nation or the business or anything, then you ought to get upset. It's not okay. It may not go away. This attitude, it'll go away, it'll pass. It may not. So you have to make sure of that. And so what was going on here is they were exploiting the situation here, and Nehemiah was upset about it. And nothing upsets a leader more than division. More than division. Nothing upsets a leader more than division. Step 2, there's some reflection. Now, you need to think before you speak. I like verse 7. You ought to underline it here. He says, then I consulted with myself. Isn't that something? Good leaders talk to themselves. Now, just because you talk to yourself doesn't mean you're a good leader. It may mean you're senile. But Nehemiah's first reaction was to get angry. But before he did anything else, he had a talk with himself about it. He got alone with God and he prayed and he thought about it, trying to get the right perspective. And so there are times when you need to talk to yourself. You need to go somewhere and maybe talk to yourself before you talk to anybody else, you know. And you need to really say, what's going on here? What's the problem? If you don't know the problem, you sure don't know the solution. You have to identify the problem. So you have to sit down and figure out what's the problem. Does that make sense to you? You can, you know, a fellow said one time, I spent all my life trying to get up the ladder of success, and when I got to the top, it was leaning against the wrong building. So you want to make sure the ladder you're climbing is on the right building, and you want to make sure the problem you're dealing with, that the solution that you have meets the problem. And you have to know what the problem is, and then you have to sit down and think about it and figure out how do I solve this problem? If you can't do that, you can't lead. So you have to set aside some time. I read a book several years ago, and I had all of our staff to read it. We wore it out. It's called Managing Management Time by William Onken. I think he was the creator of the little paces that they use in the ACE schools called the monkey pace. How many of you were in the ACE school? Any of you? Do you remember that pace, the monkey pace? How about the leaders? And you've heard the term, who's got the monkey? Yeah, by that he means who's got the responsibility. And in that book he talked about three kinds of time. And one of those time, and by the way, he used the analogy of an orange. In fact, I went down and I bought 3 of these oranges. Jason, you remember those? Those 3 oranges. I think I bought them at some kind of a foo-foo store or somewhere. I don't know what it is. But I got these oranges. They look real, but they're made out of plastic. And I took all 3 of them and I wrote something on each one of them. I took them to a staff meeting, remember? Tried to juggle them. And the idea here is in leadership, you have to be able to juggle, and time management, you have to be able to juggle all 3 of these oranges. You can't lay one aside and be a leader. So you have, in the management situation of your life, you have what you call system-imposed time. And that is what the system will impose upon you day by day. You don't have much control over it. You don't have a lot of control over it. And then there's boss-imposed time. That's when he comes into your desk and changes your whole day and messes up all your plans. That's your boss-imposed time. Then there's self-imposed. And that's where you do planning and scheduling and decide and you think things through. What do I need to do to get something done? What needs to be done? How can I build a bus route? If my bus is running 30, how can I run 60? And what do I need to do? You understand me? If my Sunday school class has got 10, how can I have 20? My small group, what do I have to do to be able to double it and start another group? You have to think about those things. And the same thing's true with the music ministry and the media ministry and the nurseries and so on. Are we just going to stay the same forever, or are we going to move forward and grow? Well, not without a plan, you're not going to. And you're not going to have a plan until you sit down and think. And so you sit down and you think. Now, here's what the average person will do. He can't lay aside his boss-imposed time, because that carries a penalty with it. And he can't lay aside the system-imposed time, because it's ever present. So guess which one he always lays aside? He'll lay aside the self-imposed time. And he'll always lay it down. And that way he doesn't do any planning, any scheduling, any thinking. And that's what happens. In leadership, you can't do that. So Nehemiah consulted with himself. He did some thinking. He did some planning, as you can see here. And so I like what it says in James chapter 1, verse 19. It says, "Wherefore, my beloved, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Now, this is the antidote when with Nehemiah, because he started thinking before he talked. And so step 2 then is reflection. It's the antidote, or really the qualifier of step 1, and it's the reaction to getting angry. You should get angry. You should get upset, but make sure you're upset about the right thing, and especially if it has somebody who's trying to ruin your home or your business or your church or your ministry. That's what you get mad about. Then before you react, you think, and you get alone, and you talk with yourself, because whatever you say or do has consequences. And you need to know how to think to make sure you handle it properly. And then the third, step 3 here is rebuke. Now you privately confront the offending party, and he went directly to the source. In verse 7, you'll notice he said, "Then I consulted with myself and rebuked the nobles and the rulers, and said to them, You exact usury, every one of his brother. And I set a great assembly against them." Boy, this got pretty serious. So he went to them, first of all, in private. And that's what you may need to do when someone's causing a problem. You go to them in private first, and if you can settle it, good, it's settled. You don't need to make an issue of it. And you talk to them about what they're doing and the danger of what they're doing, and if they're doing something wrong. And so you do that, and you get it settled. I was down in Arizona here a few months ago, and I preached at Andy Wirtz's church. And he called me up and he said, "Brother Blue, I want you to preach on Bible interpretation and Bible prophecy." He said, "Our theme this year is rediscovering the Bible." I said, "Okay." So I got my sermons together, and I went down and I preached. And one night I just preached the last night I was there, I preached the last chapter, the introduction to the book of Revelation. And I was pretty heavy on dispensations. And I did not follow the traditional view of the book of Revelation and where it's divided at chapter 4 and all that kind of stuff. So then Brother Andy called me up the next day, and he had the friendliest guy in church had caused him some trouble. What he did is he wrote about a 5-page letter for the pastor, and he also sent it to the trustees in the church. Well, now the trustees have this letter accusing Brother Andy of holding the same dispensational views that I do, and demanding that he write a letter stating that he did not agree with me. Now, I'd have killed the guy. No, I wouldn't have killed him. That'd be too easy. I wouldn't kill anybody, but I might want to. But boy, oh boy, I hate to even think about that kind of stuff. But Andy's such a nice guy. I hate nice guys like that. You know, you want blood or something in that. He said, "Oh, it'll be all right, preacher." I said, "It won't be all right." So he's written this letter and demanding that Andy write a letter stating that he disagrees with me. So you see what this bird's doing already? He's trying to create a division. So Brother Wirtz found some tracts and some brochures on how to deal with conflicts in the church. And in that brochure, it clearly said if you've got a problem with somebody, you go to them in private and you try to resolve it. And so he wrote a letter to this guy, and no, he didn't. He wrote a letter, and he included this tract, and he handed it to him on a Sunday morning to this guy and said, "I want you to read it." And so Sunday afternoon, this guy gets on the phone and calls the trustees and sets up a meeting with them and the pastor doesn't even know about it. So the pastor gets to church. Brother Wirtz gets to church Sunday night, and he finds out that this disgruntled member has called a trustees meeting. I told him on the phone, I said, you better get rid of him. Get him out of church or out of Arizona or something. This guy is a snake. And so Brother Wirtz went to the trustees meeting, and this guy had called, and the trustees. And Brother Wirtz said, I just let him talk. I just let him talk. And finally I told him, I said, you know what? You should have came to me with your problem. And if that wasn't satisfactory, we could have gone to Pastor Blue. That's where you have the problem. And you violated Scripture at every point. He said, I did not. I told you. He said, no, you did not. You sent me a letter just like you sent the trustees. And this guy said, well, I'm just going to quit the church. I'd have started speaking in tongues right then. I'd have said, glory to God, hallelujah, there is a God, you know. And Andy Wirtz said, okay. And he left, praise God. After he left, the trustees said, you know, Pastor, you can't be responsible for everything someone says in this church. And no one should hold you accountable for what a guest speaker says. Problem solved. But you see, this guy, he didn't want to solve the problem. He wanted power. He wanted authority. He wanted to split the church. And I found out later there were other issues. And I also found out from Pastor Wirtz that he had been asked to leave his former church. So he's a troublemaker. See, he needs to come here and take Class 101 and sign our covenant. So I hate confronting people. It's not fun. I don't like it. But I've learned that it's necessary for the good of everybody. And I either have to deal with my fears and protect myself, or I have to deal with problems and protect this church, which I choose to do. And I've learned that the longer I wait, the more courage it takes to confront. The longer you wait, the more courage it takes, because you have all these ghosts going on in your brain, you know, and you become more chicken, you know, you're chicken little, and you chicken out the longer you wait. All right? All right, leadership then must have the courage to confront. And you have to confront people in your church and in your ministry who are harming it, are not doing their job. If you're ever going to be a leader, this is a skill you have to develop. And it takes courage to confront. And if you don't have courage, then you can't lead. You need to speak the truth in love, of course. But leadership requires courage. It's not a popularity contest. It's not a popularity contest. It's not everybody thinking you're good or nice. One lady said to a pastor about their pastor, our pastor is such a wonderful person. And it was at a church growth seminar on how to build churches. And the leader of the seminar said, churches are not built on wonderful pastors. They're built on people doing the right things. Does that make sense to you? Why, sure. You can't build a bus route because you're a wonderful person. You can't sing just because you're a nice guy. Doesn't mean you're not a nice person. Doesn't mean you're not wonderful, but it still doesn't qualify you, see, for the position. And so, I'm going to confront, I don't really care how things turn out. If I need to, I'm going to confront the issue head on. And let me just say this, in 38 years, I probably have not had over 3 issues to where they didn't turn out well. Just about 3 of them. And but you have to deal with them, and sometimes people they're not aware. Sometimes they are. They just need to be confronted. You have to let the chips fall where they do. And for the good of your family, or the good of the ministry, or the good of your business, or the good of the church. You have to do that. Okay? And look at Titus 3. We're just about through. Look at Titus chapter 3, verse 10 and 11, because they're to warn troublemakers. Titus 3:10, a man that is a heretic after the first or second admonition reject. This is a guy in your church, knowing that he that is of such is subverted and sinneth being condemned himself. So one of the tasks of leaders is to warn troublemakers. And I've seen a lot of pastors and leaders fail to confront a divisive person out of fear of losing the person. You can't have that kind of fear. You can't have it. You have to have loyal people. You have to have good people, especially in leadership. In leadership, you've got to have loyal people, you've got to have capable people, and you've got to have people that are not troublemakers. And so I've seen a lot of pastors fail in that area. And they'll lose, you have to lose them to save the church. Then there's the resolution. You publicly deal with public division. And you have to know what's going on and how to deal with that, okay? Then I'm going to skip down to number 5, reinforcement. You have to set an example of unselfishness. In verse 14, Nehemiah, the foundation of all that Nehemiah, of all of his leadership, was he led by example. Nehemiah was an example. So when he was asked to build the wall, he was out on the wall rebuilding it. He was visible. Leaders have to be visible. When we were building all of these buildings, there never was a work day that I wasn't here. Brother Dave, you remember? He's just shaking his head. Paul's up there. Paul was just a little guy. I'd say, go get that. He was my gopher. And Paul was just a little boy back then, but he could work. And that's why he's got a good work ethic, because I trained him. But we never had a work party. My wife was always here. She was down in the kitchen. They would cook a meal, and we'd have steak dinners after the Monday night work parties. And I'd work these, not hamburgers. Bob, you weren't even here. You were still lost. In fact, I'm wondering tonight. But my point is this. You cannot sit in your office and be a leader. You cannot lead from a distance. You have to be visible. The troops have to see you. See, when you got a work party going on and people are working and you're not visible, they wonder if you're sitting at home on the recliner watching TV while they work. Now, you may be in the hospital dying, but they don't know that. See, people don't know that. So you need to be seen. Good managers walk around their store. They're seen by their employees and by their customers. You lead by being visible. Good generals stand up in the Jeep so everybody can see them. And the troops like that because they get shot, But you have to be seen. Does that make sense to you? You have to be seen if you're going to lead something. And so Nehemiah was the first there. When he asked them to help the poor, he'd already been doing it out of his pocket. Now, over the years, I haven't done this in the last 4 or 5 years. I think once we've done it. But over the years when we were building, every Sunday night we'd raise money. And I would ask our people every time, how many of you will give $100 to help? And I said, I'll give the first 100. And that night my wife would write a check for at least $100. Because it isn't right as a leader to ask people to do something that you're not willing to do. That's hypocrisy. I would never ask you to sacrifice if I wasn't sacrificing. That's hypocrisy. I do not use my people. I've had opportunities. People want me to get in some kind of business like Amway or Tupperware or something else. I said, I don't want to get in that. I'll tell you why. I do not want to look at church members as customers. Otherwise, I've got a position here. The next thing you know, I'd be abusing my position and using it to get you to buy my product. And I could do it. I'm the pastor. You understand me? So I refuse to do it. I refuse to do it. 9 out of 10 times when Bob Usher cuts my hair, I pay him $1. No, I do. I can stand right up here and he's sitting here. I'm not ashamed to say it. I pay him. I gave him $20. I'm still waiting for my change, but I gave him $20 the other day. You understand, you have to set the example of unselfishness. I know a pastor friend, and he is a good friend of mine. If he's in the ministry tonight, I'm not sure, but he has probably been in the ministry minimum of 25 years. He cannot build a church. In fact, my wife and I mentioned his name today. He cannot build a church. You know why? Because he's selfish. He is selfish. He's after everything he can get, and if he can get it free, it's better yet. And he's a con. And he cons his people, and he thinks they're all stupid and they can't see it. I doubt if he's got one family left. He's always after something. You see, leadership, you know what you have to be after? The good of your people. That's what you have to be after. You don't use your people to build a church. You use your church to build people. See? And so Nehemiah was a great leader. Look at verse 13. And all the congregation said amen and praised the Lord, and the people did according to this promise. And so what was going on here is that, they were going to repay the interest. Nehemiah confronted them and said, you need to pay the interest back to the 100%. And so they did it. They said, we're going to do it. Thank God for that, right? And so Nehemiah, says as a leader that you have to display unselfishness, and certainly he was that kind of a leader. Did you know the Apostle Paul said, be ye followers of me as I am of Christ? That's what he said. Can you imagine? He said, be ye followers of me as I am of Christ. Could you say, be ye followers of me? You say, oh no, I could never say that. Why not? Why not? You see, you indict yourself when you say, I couldn't say that. Out of your own mouth. Why wouldn't you want somebody to follow you? Or are you taking them? You say, oh, I'm modest. I wouldn't want anybody following me. Phooey. That's a Greek word for something else. So the leadership law, leaders only ask others to do what they are already doing, what they're willing to do. So that was the secret of Nehemiah's boldness. Did you know the Bible said the righteous are as bold as a lion? But the wicked flee when no man pursueth. See, the thing that builds boldness and confidence is doing the right thing. Then you got a clear spirit, you got a clear mind, you got a clear conscience, because you're doing the right thing. See? And when you're not doing the right thing, then you're dealing with, and it causes all kinds of personality conflicts that go on. And so you need to be able to say, do as I do, if you're going to follow the Lord. So organizations have fewer conflicts when leaders live unselfishly and model that. All right? I hope you don't think I've been selfish with the time, but nevertheless, I hope that's some of the things that will help you. And we've got some folks who are leaders in here, and some folks that I hope will be. But listen to me, I'll never forget what Dick Meyer, my pastor, said to me when I was a young man in Omaha, Nebraska. He said, if you want your people to jump a foot, you're going to have to jump 10 feet. That is, you have to set the example. If you want people to be in your ministry, you have to be there. If you want them to be in church, you got to be there. If you want your people to give, you have to give. If you want your people to read the Bible, you got to read your Bible. If you want your people to pray, you're going to have to pray. You are the leader. And everything rises and falls on leadership. You got it? Say, got it. Good. All right, let's stand together. We'll be dismissed in a word of prayer. All right. Brother Murphy, anything we need to say?